Karl Marx was born on May 5, 1818, in the town of Trier, a small city on the western edge of what was then the Prussian Rhineland. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a lawyer who had studied at the University of Bonn. The family was middle class, comfortable enough to send their children to good schools, but not wealthy enough to avoid the worries of paying taxes and keeping the household running. The mother, Henriette Pressburg, came from a Jewish family that had recently converted to Christianity. She brought a strong sense of discipline and a love of reading into the home. The household was filled with books, newspapers, and lively conversations about politics and law. In this environment, a young Karl learned to listen, to question, and to read carefully. As a child, Karl often walked with his older brother, Edgar, to the market square in Trier. The market stall was a place of colour and sound. Merchants shouted the price of fresh apples. Bakers displayed loaves of bread, and a man in a soot-covered coat sold coal. Karl watched the way the prices changed from day to day, how the poor haggled and the rich paid without looking. He saw the gap between a man who could buy a whole sack of flour and a child who could only afford a crust of bread. This simple scene left a lasting impression. Later in life, Marx would write about the clash between those who own the means of production and those who must sell their labour. The market stall gave him a first glimpse of that clash. Another everyday moment helped shape his mind. At the age of 10, Karl found a copy of the local newspaper tucked under a stack of pamphlets in his father's study. The paper was filled with reports of wars, trade agreements, and the latest edicts from the king. One article described a new tax on grain that would make bread more expensive for the poor. Karl read the words slowly, his brow furrowing. He asked his mother why the government would make life harder for those who already struggled. Henriette answered that the state often acted in the interest of those who held power. The newspaper became a window into the world of politics, and the question of why the rich could make rules that hurt the poor began to grow in his mind. Education was the next major influence. In 1835, at the age of 17, Karl entered the University of Bonn to study law. The university was a bustling place, full of students from many German states. The lectures were long, and the professors spoke in a formal, sometimes distant tone. Yet Karl found a teacher who sparked his curiosity. The professor of philosophy, Ernst Hegel. Hegel's ideas were complex, but the core was that history moves forward as a series of ideas that clash and combine. Hegel called this process the dialectic. In simple terms, the dialectic means that a thought, thesis, meets an opposite thought, antithesis, and the conflict creates a new thought, synthesis. Marx later took this pattern and used it to describe how societies change. Marx did not finish his law degree at Bonn. He transferred to the University of Berlin in 1836, where he could study philosophy more deeply. Berlin was a hotbed of political discussion. Young men gathered in cafes, reading the latest pamphlets, debating the rights of workers, and planning protests. Marx joined a group called the Young Hegelians, who tried to apply Hegel's ideas to current social problems. They argued that the state and the church were still holding back human freedom. In these meetings, Marx learned how to argue, how to write clearly, and how to link ideas to real life. The influence of Hegel was strong, but it was not the only influence. Marx's father, though a lawyer, was a man who cared about justice. He had been forced to change his religion to become a Christian, a decision made to protect his career and family. This experience taught Karl that laws and institutions could be shaped by fear and survival, not only by reason. His mother, on the other hand, kept a steady hand on the household finances. She taught him how to budget, how to stretch a small amount of money, and how to keep the family fed during hard times. Both parents showed Marx that ideas and practical needs often lived side by side. In 1842, after completing his studies, Marx earned a doctorate in philosophy. His dissertation was on the differences between the natural philosophy of Democritus and the moral philosophy of Epicurus. The work showed his ability to compare ancient ideas and to write in a clear, logical way. Yet the real turning point came a few years later, when Europe was shaken by a series of revolutions. The year 1848 is often called the Spring of Nations. Across the continent, people rose up against monarchies, demanded more rights, and called for national unification. In France, a new republic was declared after the fall of King Louis-Philippe. In the German states, including the one where Marx lived, students and workers demanded a constitution, free speech, and the end of feudal privileges. In the Austrian Empire, Hungarians and Italians pressed for independence. These uprisings were sparked by a mix of economic hardship, rising nationalism, and the spread of new ideas about liberty and equality. Marx was in the middle of this storm. He wrote articles for a radical newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung, which was based in Cologne. The paper criticized the Prussian government, called out corruption, and demanded that workers have a voice. The authorities did not like this, and in 1843 the newspaper was shut down. Marx's editor, Wilhelm Wolff, was arrested, and Marx himself faced censorship. The experience taught him that the state could silence dissent with force, and that ideas alone were not enough to protect freedom. A second anecdote from the 1840s shows how Marx's thinking was shaped by personal encounters. While living in Paris in 1845, Marx met a French socialist named Pierre Leroux. Leroux spoke of humanism, the belief that all people have inherent worth and should share in the wealth of society. He also talked about the social question, which meant that the poor were suffering because the rich owned most of the land and factories. Marx listened, took notes, and later wrote in a letter to his friend Arnold Rouge, "The problem of the working class is the problem of humanity itself." This short line captures how Marx began to link personal hardship with larger social structures. The influence of Hegel's dialectic stayed with Marx, but he began to see a flaw. Hegel placed the process of change inside the realm of ideas, almost as if ideas moved on their own. Marx argued that ideas move because of material conditions, the way people produce food, clothing, and shelter. He wrote later that mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. In simple terms, the way people make a living shapes the way they think and organize. Marx's early life also included moments of hardship that may have contributed to his later focus on class struggle. After his father died in 1838, the family lost a steady source of income. The young Marx had to find work to help support his mother and siblings. He took a job as a tutor for a wealthy family in the Rhineland. The children he taught lived in a large house with servants, while the surrounding village struggled with poverty. This contrast made the idea of class more than an abstract term. It was a daily reality. The question remains, how much did Marx's upbringing really shape his later ideas? Some scholars argue that his middle-class background gave him the education, the language skills, and the time to think deeply about society. They point out that many of his early writings show a comfort with academic theory that would be hard for a poor worker to acquire. They say that without a solid education, Marx could not have built the complex arguments that later influenced the world. A counter-argument comes from those who focus on the personal experiences of poverty and oppression in Marx's life. They note that Marx's family faced financial strain, that he lived in cramped apartments in Paris and London, and that he often struggled to feed his own children. They argue that these hardships gave him a personal stake in the fight for workers' rights, and that his ideas are rooted in lived experience rather than abstract study alone. Another line of thought questions the role of Hegel in Marx's formation. Some critics claim that Marx's later break from Hegel was more a strategic move to distance himself from a popular philosophy rather than a deep intellectual shift. They point out that Marx still used the dialectic method, but applied it to economics instead of pure ideas. In this view, the influence of Hegel is less about genuine belief and more about borrowing a useful tool. In contrast, supporters of the Hegelian influence argue that the dialectic shaped Marx's view of history as a series of conflicts that lead to new social orders. They cite Marx's own words from the preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, where he writes, "All history is the history of class struggles." This line shows how the Hegelian idea of conflict was turned into a material analysis of class. Marx's education also gave him a love for writing. He kept a notebook of quotes and ideas, a habit he learned from his father's study. In one entry, he copied a line from a newspaper article about a factory fire that killed several workers. He wrote, "The loss of life is counted as a loss of profit." This simple observation later appeared in his famous work, Kapital, where he described how capital treats human life as a cost. The family's religious background also left a mark. Henriette Pressburg's Jewish roots, combined with the family's conversion to Christianity, exposed Marx to questions of identity, belonging, and the power of institutions. In a letter to his friend Engels, Marx wrote, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature." This quote shows how personal history fed into his critique of how ideas can be used to keep people in place. Marx's early experiences also included moments of joy that balanced the seriousness of his later work. As a teenager, he loved to play the piano, a skill taught by his mother. Music offered a brief escape from the weight of political debates. He also enjoyed walking along the Moselle River, watching the boats carry goods up and down the waterway. The river reminded him of how people depend on each other for trade, a simple image that later became a metaphor for the flow of capital. When Marx moved to London in 1849, after the failed revolutions of 1848, he entered a city that was the heart of the industrial world. Factories belched smoke, ships arrived loaded with raw cotton, and the streets were crowded with workers. He lived in a tiny room in a boarding house, shared with other political exiles. The cramped conditions forced him to write by candlelight, but also gave him direct access to the daily grind of the working class. He would watch the dock workers unload cargo, hear their songs, and feel their exhaustion. These scenes reinforced the ideas he had formed as a boy watching a market stall. Marx's early life also included a friendship that would become one of the most important partnerships in modern thought. In 1844, while living in Paris, he met Friedrich Engels, a young German from a wealthy industrial family. Engels had visited his father's factory in the Ruhr region and saw the harsh conditions of the workers there. He wrote to Marx, "I have seen the workers die of hunger while the owners grow fat." This letter sparked a lifelong collaboration. Engels later supplied Marx with money, research material, and a clear view of industrial capitalism. Their partnership showed how personal connections can turn ideas into action. The story of Marx's early years is not just a list of dates and facts. It is a series of moments that together built a mind that would later challenge the world. A boy watching a market stall, a teenager reading a newspaper, a student listening to Hegel, a young man feeling the heat of a factory fire. Each scene added a piece to the puzzle. The family's modest means, the loss of a father, the struggle to pay rent. The young Karl Marx sat in a cramped room in Paris in early 1848, his mind buzzing with ideas about how people live and work. Across the table, Friedrich Engels leaned forward, his notebook open, his eyes sharp. The two men had met a few years earlier in Cologne, where they had already talked about the misery of workers and the power of capital. Now, with the streets of Europe trembling under a wave of revolts, they felt a sudden urgency. They decided to write a short pamphlet that would lay out their view of history, of class, and of the future. The result would become known as the Communist Manifesto, a text that still sparks debate more than a century later. Marx and Engels began by sharing a simple picture of society. They imagined a group of friends sharing a pizza. If one friend takes most of the slices while the others get only crumbs, the friends will feel unfairly treated. They will argue, they will try to change the rules, or they will simply stop sharing pizza altogether. The same pattern, they wrote, repeats in the world of work. The people who own factories, land, and machines take most of the profit, while the workers who operate the machines receive only a small part. This imbalance, they said, creates a struggle between two main groups or classes. The struggle is not just about money, but about power, respect, and the chance to shape one's own life. A second everyday picture helped to make the idea clearer. Imagine a household where chores are divided. If one person does most of the cleaning, cooking, and laundry, while the other only watches television, the first person will feel overburdened and resentful. The household will become tense, and arguments will rise. If the chores are shared more fairly, the home runs smoothly, and the people feel more connected. Marx and Engels used this image to show how, when the work of producing goods is divided unequally, the whole society feels the strain. The owners of the means of production, factories, mines, farms, are like the lazy roommate who does not help. The workers are like the overworked sibling who does all the heavy lifting. The conflict that follows is what they called class struggle. The pamphlet began with a bold call that still echoes in crowds today. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. This line was not a random slogan. It summed up the idea that workers across different countries share the same interests. Marx and Engels argued that the problems of a factory worker in Manchester were the same as those of a textile worker in Lyon. Because the system that created the problem was the same, the solution had to be common. They wrote that the history of all societies is the history of class struggles. In the past, the struggle was between slaves and masters, then between serfs and nobles, and now between the bourgeoisie, those who own capital, and the proletariat, the working class. To give the argument weight, Marx and Engels listed a series of events that showed the rise of the bourgeoisie. They described how, after the medieval period, trade and industry grew, creating a new class that owned factories and banks. This class needed a large pool of workers to run the machines, and so they hired people who owned no land or capital. The workers sold their labor for wages. Over time, the owners accumulated more wealth, while the workers stayed poor. The authors said this pattern would continue unless the workers organized and took control of the means of production. The first historical anecdote in the story of the Manifesto comes from the wave of revolts that swept Europe in 18. In February, the people of Paris rose up against King Louis Philippe, demanding a republic and better living conditions. In March, uprisings erupted in Vienna, Berlin, and Prague. In each city, workers and middle-class citizens marched, shouted, and sometimes built barricades. The revolts were driven by a mix of economic hardship, political repression, and a desire for more rights. Marx and Engels saw these uprisings as evidence that the working class was ready to challenge the existing order. They wrote that the events of 1848 showed the world that the old feudal structures were crumbling and that a new, more modern conflict was taking shape. The second anecdote concerns the very first publication of the Manifesto. On February 21, 1848, a small printing press in London produced the first edition of the pamphlet. It was printed in German, the language of most of the author's early readers, and only a few thousand copies were made. The pamphlet was cheap, meant to be handed out on the streets, at meetings, and in coffee houses. The authors hoped that the words would travel quickly, like a seed blown by the wind, reaching workers in factories and mines. The first edition carried a short preface that explained the purpose: to show the world the nature of the class struggle and to call for a united front of workers. The modest printing run meant that the text spread slowly at first, but the ideas caught fire in the minds of those who read them. Marx and Engels did not just list grievances. They offered a vision of a different society. They imagined a world where the means of production, factories, land, tools, were owned by the community as a whole. In such a world, the products of labor would be shared according to need, not according to how much capital one owned. They described this as a more communist society, a term that later thinkers would interpret in many ways. The authors wrote that the transition to this society would require a revolutionary change, a break from the old system, because the owners of capital would not give up their power willingly. The manifesto also contained a set of immediate demands that could be pursued even before a full revolution. These included measures such as a progressive income tax, free education for all children, and the abolition of child labor. The authors believed that these reforms would improve the lives of workers while also exposing the limits of the capitalist system. By granting some rights, the bourgeoisie hoped to calm the workers, but the deeper conflict would remain. The pamphlet suggested that each reform was a step toward the larger goal of ending class divisions. Not everyone agreed that the manifesto was a work of philosophy. Some critics argued that it was more political propaganda than a thoughtful analysis of ideas. One counterargument claimed that Marx and Engels used dramatic language and slogans to rally the masses, but they offered little in the way of rigorous reasoning. The critics said that the text relied on emotional appeal, like the pizza analogy, to persuade readers rather than on careful logical proof. They suggested that the work functioned more as a rallying cry for a political movement than as a systematic philosophical treatise. A second counter-argument focused on the historical context of the pamphlet. Critics pointed out that the manifesto was written during a time of intense social unrest, when many groups were seeking any tool that could help them rise against the ruling class. From this perspective, the pamphlet was a piece of strategic writing, designed to unite disparate groups under a common banner. The argument went that the authors borrowed ideas from earlier thinkers, such as Saint-Simon and the French utopians, but reshaped them into a political program. Because the primary goal was to incite action, the critics said, the work should be read as a political pamphlet, not as a lasting philosophical contribution. Supporters of the manifesto responded to these criticisms by pointing to the depth of the analysis. They noted that Marx and Engels did more than shout slogans. They offered a materialist view of history. This view, called historical materialism, explained that the way people produce what they need shapes the whole structure of society, including politics, law, and culture. By showing how economic forces drive social change, the authors provided a framework that could be used to understand many events, from the French Revolution to the rise of industrial capitalism. The idea that material conditions, not just ideas, shape history was a philosophical claim, not merely a political one. The manifesto's influence spread far beyond its first edition. In the years after 1848, the pamphlet was translated into many languages, including English, French, and Russian. Workers in different countries used the text to organize strikes, to form unions, and to demand better wages. The call to unite resonated in factories across Europe and later in the United States. The ideas also inspired later thinkers who built on Marx's analysis, such as Rosa Luxemburg, Antonio Gramsci, and later the leaders of the Soviet Union. Each of these figures interpreted the original text in their own way, showing how a single document can generate many different movements. Modern interpretations of the manifesto often focus on how the class struggle appears in today's world. Some scholars compare the owners of factories in the 19th century to the owners of tech platforms and multinational corporations today. The same pattern of a small group controlling the means of production. Now data, algorithms, and global supply chains, while a large number of workers receive a small share of the wealth, can be seen in the gig economy, in low-wage retail jobs, and in the growing gap between CEOs and employees. The pizza analogy still works. If a few people decide who gets the biggest slice of a digital pizza, the rest will feel left out and may push for a fairer division. Another modern example uses the chores analogy to explain how automation changes the labor market. Imagine a household where a robot vacuum does the floor cleaning, but a person still has to cook, wash dishes, and take care of children. If the robot represents capital that can replace some work, the remaining chores become more valuable and more demanding for the human. In the same way, as machines take over certain jobs, the workers who remain must negotiate new terms, new wages, and new rights. The struggle over who controls the robot, who decides its schedule, and who benefits from its work mirrors the class struggle described in the manifesto. The text also contains a number of memorable quotes that have been repeated in speeches, protests, and classrooms. One line reads, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." This sentence captures the core claim that every major change in society involves conflict between groups with opposing interests. Another famous passage declares, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win." These words aim to inspire hope and action, reminding readers that the struggle is not hopeless. In addition to the two historical anecdotes already mentioned, another story from the early days of the manifesto adds color to its origin. When Marx first showed the draft to a group of German workers in Brussels, the listeners were skeptical. One worker asked, "What will this paper do for us? Will it bring us food?" Marx answered that the paper was a map, not a miracle. The workers took the pamphlet home, read it by candlelight, and discussed it over tea. Some of them later joined the revolutionary committee that tried to spark an uprising in the Rhineland. Though the uprising failed, the experience showed how a short text could travel through personal networks and spark political activity. A further anecdote concerns the reaction of the authorities after the pamphlet's first publication. The Prussian police, aware of the growing unrest, ordered a search of the printing shop that produced the manifesto. The police seized a few copies, but many had already been distributed to cafes and reading rooms. The authorities labeled the pamphlet as subversive and banned its sale. Yet the ban only made the text more attractive to curious readers. Underground copies were passed from hand to hand, and the phrase "Workers of the World, Unite" began to appear on banners at protests. The attempt to suppress the pamphlet highlighted how powerful ideas can spread even under censorship. The manifesto structure also contributed to its lasting impact. It opened with a powerful introduction, then laid out a historical analysis, followed by a list of immediate measures, and concluded with a call to action. This clear layout made the ideas easy to follow, even for readers without a philosophical background. The use of plain language, short sentences, and vivid examples, like the pizza and chores analogies, helped the pamphlet reach a broad audience. The authors deliberately avoided dense academic language, preferring to speak directly to people who lived in factories and markets. Critics who view the manifesto as propaganda often point to the way the text frames the bourgeoisie as a monolithic enemy. They argue that not all capital owners are exploitative, and that some may support reforms that benefit workers. By painting, Karl Marx once said, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it." That sentence shows the heart of his view. It tells that ideas are not just thoughts. They are linked to the things people own, the work they do, and the places they live. This view is called historical materialism. It means that the material world, the stuff that can be seen and touched, shapes the ideas that people have. Think of a family that has a tight budget. If the family must pay for food, rent, and school fees, they will choose cheap meals, small apartments, and public schools. Their ideas about what is normal will match those choices. They may think that a simple life is enough, or they may feel that the world is unfair because they cannot afford more. The budget, the material condition, pushes the family to think in a certain way. If the budget grows, the family may buy a car, move to a bigger house, and send children to private schools. Their ideas about success, safety, and happiness will shift. The material change in money leads to a change in ideas. Now picture a school that has old desks, cracked windows, and few books. The teachers cannot use computers or labs. The students will learn mainly from textbooks and lectures. Their ideas about science, technology, and the future will be limited by what the school can provide. If the school receives new computers, a science lab, and a library, the students can explore new topics. Their ideas about what is possible will expand. The material resources of the school shape the ideas of the students. Marx argued that the same pattern works for whole societies. He looked at the big picture of history. He said that the way people produce food, make clothes, and build things creates the social structure. That structure then creates ideas about law, religion, and morality. In his own words, the mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process. In simple terms, how people make a living decides how they think about the world. The Industrial Revolution gives a clear example. In the late 1700s, machines began to spin cotton faster than hands could. Factories sprang up in towns near rivers. Workers left farms and went to work in long, noisy buildings. Their lives changed. They woke up early, worked long hours, and lived in crowded houses. Because of these material changes, new ideas about work, class, and fairness grew. Workers began to talk about rights, wages, and safe conditions. The material shift from hand tools to machines created a new way of thinking. A second anecdote comes from the rise of steel factories in the United States. In the 1880s, steel mills in places like Pittsburgh hired thousands of immigrants. The factories needed raw iron, coal, and huge amounts of labor. The workers lived in company towns where the owner owned the store, the housing, and the school. Because the material world was controlled by the factory owners, the workers saw a clear link between ownership and power. They organized into unions, demanded better pay, and fought for a voice in the workplace. The material conditions of the factories sparked ideas about collective action and workers' rights. Marx did not think ideas were useless. He believed ideas could also push material change, but only when they arise from material needs. Some thinkers argue that ideas can lead the way before the material world catches up. This is the first counterargument. For example, the Enlightenment thinkers wrote about liberty, equality, and reason. Their books inspired the American and French revolutions. In those cases, ideas about rights and government seemed to spark changes in law, land ownership, and the economy. The argument says that a powerful idea can reshape material reality. A second counterargument comes from the spread of religious ideas. When the Protestant Reformation began, Martin Luther's writings challenged the Catholic Church. His ideas about personal faith and reading the Bible in one's own language led to the creation of new churches, new schools, and new ways of governing. The material world changed because of the ideas. The counterargument says that ideas can be a catalyst that forces material change, even if the material base was not yet ready. Marx would respond that those ideas did not appear in a vacuum. He would point out that the printing press, the rise of a merchant class, and the growth of cities created conditions that made Luther's ideas possible. The material changes gave space for new thoughts. In the same way, the Enlightenment ideas grew in a world where trade, science, and a growing middle class already existed. The material world set the stage, and the ideas played their part on that stage. Modern thinkers still use historical materialism to look at today's world. Consider the rise of smartphones. The factories that make chips, the mines that extract rare earth metals, and the global supply chains are material conditions. Because these devices are everywhere, people now think about communication, privacy, and identity in new ways. The material spread of technology shapes ideas about how society should work. Another modern example is climate change. The way societies have built factories, cars, and power plants creates the problem of carbon emissions. Those material conditions have led to ideas about sustainability, green energy, and climate justice. Activists argue that changing the material base, by building wind farms, electric cars, and new laws, will shift the ideas people hold about the planet. The pattern repeats. Material facts shape thoughts, and thoughts can push for new material changes. A simple analogy can help. Imagine a river that flows through a garden. The water is the material condition. The plants are the ideas. If the river runs low, the plants wilt. If the river floods, the plants grow tall. The water does not think. It just moves. The plants react to the water. In the same way, the material world moves and ideas respond. Another analogy uses a kitchen. The ingredients on the counter are the material conditions. The recipe a cook follows is the idea. If the kitchen only has beans and rice, the cook can make a simple stew. If the kitchen gets fresh vegetables, spices, and meat, the cook can create a richer dish. The ingredients limit what can be cooked. The same holds for societies. The resources they have limit the ideas they can develop. Historical anecdotes show the pattern again. During the Great Depression, many families lost jobs and homes. The material hardship led to new ideas about government aid, social safety nets, and public works. In the United States, the New Deal programs created jobs, built roads, and provided insurance. The ideas of a more active government grew because the material crisis demanded it. In post-World War I Japan, the country's ruined factories and limited resources forced a focus on efficiency and technology. The material need to rebuild led to ideas about quality control, just, in-time production, and continuous improvement. Those ideas later spread worldwide as lean manufacturing. The material push to recover sparked a new way of thinking about work. Quotes from Marx help keep the focus clear. He wrote, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." In plain words, how people live and work decides how they think. Another line from his work. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Shows that the fight between those who own resources and those who work for them is a material conflict that creates ideas about justice and power. When looking at schools today, the material condition of internet access matters. A school with fast Wi-Fi can use online videos, interactive tools, and global collaborations. Students in that school may think that learning can happen anywhere, that the world is connected, and that careers in tech are reachable. A school without internet may still rely on textbooks and lectures. Its students may think that learning is limited to the classroom and that jobs are local. The material tool of the internet shapes the ideas about education and future work. Families also show the pattern in everyday life. A family that can afford fresh food, a garden, and a bike may think about health, the environment, and self-reliance. A family that must rely on fast food and public transport may think about convenience, cost, and limited time. The material choices set the stage for ideas about lifestyle and values. Critics who say ideas lead material change often point to the civil rights movement in the United States. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about equality and justice. Their speeches inspired protests, new laws, and changes in voting rights. The material world, schools, workplaces, and public spaces shifted because of the power of ideas. Marx would note that the movement grew out of a material reality of segregation, economic inequality, and police violence. The ideas gave shape to the material struggle. Another critique comes from the feminist movement. Early writers like Mary Wollstonecraft argued for women's education and rights. Those ideas helped create new laws, new job opportunities, and new social expectations. The material world changed as women entered factories, universities, and politics. Again, the ideas sparked change, but they were rooted in a material world where women were limited by law, wages, and social norms. Marx's response would be that the ideas of Wollstonecraft and King could not have taken hold without the material conditions that made people listen. In the case of civil rights, the migration of African Americans to northern cities, the rise of a black middle class, and the economic need for labor created a space for new ideas. In the case of feminism, the Industrial Revolution brought women into factories, making them earn wages and see the need for legal protection. The material shift opened a door for ideas to walk through. Today, historical materialism can be used to understand the gig economy. Platforms like ride-share apps provide a new way to earn money. The technology, smartphones, GPS, and internet are material conditions. Because these tools exist, people think about work as flexible, independent, and on demand. The idea that a job can be taken one ride at a time spreads. At the same time, the lack of traditional benefits pushes ideas about workers' rights, unionization, and regulation. The material platform creates the idea, and the idea pushes for new material rules. Another current example is social media. The hardware of smartphones, the bandwidth of networks, and the algorithms of platforms are material. They shape how people share news, form opinions, and organize. Because the material tools allow instant sharing, ideas about democracy, privacy, and identity travel faster. The material base of the internet changes the political ideas of a generation. In education, the shift to online learning during the pandemic showed the power of material conditions. Schools that had laptops and broadband could move classes online. Their ideas about what learning looks like changed quickly. Schools without those tools struggled, and their ideas about education stayed more traditional. The material gap created a gap in ideas about how teaching can happen. Historical materialism also helps explain why some societies adopt new technologies faster than others. A country with abundant natural resources, strong factories, and a skilled workforce can produce cheap solar panels. The material ability to make panels leads to ideas about renewable energy, climate policy, and economic growth. A country lacking those resources may keep using coal, and its ideas about energy stay focused on cheap, existing methods. The material capacity shapes the ideas about the future. Marx's core claim remains simple. Material life comes first, ideas follow. The family budget, the school's resources, the factory's machines, the internet's bandwidth, all are material. They set the limits and possibilities for what people think. Ideas can push back, but they usually do so because the material world has opened a space. To sum up, historical materialism tells a story of cause and effect that starts with what people own and produce. It shows how a change in the way food is grown, how clothes are sewn, or how information travels can change the way people view the world. It also reminds that ideas, while powerful, often need a material stage to be heard. The story of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of factories, the spread of smartphones, and the push for climate action all fit this pattern. By looking at the material side first, one can see why certain ideas appear, why they spread, and how they can eventually reshape the material world in return. Class struggle is the idea that people who own the tools of work and people who sell their time to use those tools are often at odds. The owners try to keep as much profit as they can. The workers try to get enough pay and safe conditions to live. This clash is not a single fight. It is a pattern that repeats in many places and times. It is the engine that Marx said moves history forward. In a small coffee shop, a barista arrives early each morning. The barista makes drinks, greets customers, and cleans tables. The owner sets the price of each coffee, decides the schedule, and takes the money at the end of the day. The barista sees that the shop makes more money than the wages paid. The barista asks for a raise. The owner says the rent and the beans cost a lot, so there is no room for higher pay. The barista feels the work is hard, the hours are long, and the tip share is small. The owner feels the risk of losing the shop if profit falls. This everyday scene shows the two sides of class struggle. One side wants more of the profit. The other side wants to keep profit to stay alive. A student at a public university faces a different kind of clash. The student wants to study, graduate, and find a good job. The university charges tuition each semester. The student asks the administration to lower the fee because many families cannot afford the rise. The administration replies that the university needs money for buildings, research, and staff salaries. The student may organize a petition or join a student union to demand lower costs. The administration may offer a small scholarship, but keep the main price high. Here, the student is like a worker who sells time for education, while the university acts like an owner that controls the price of that education. The push and pull between the two groups is another picture of class struggle. In the 1840s, factories in England began to grow fast. Workers were hired to operate machines that made cloth. The owners paid low wages and forced long hours. In 1842, a group of weavers in a town called Preston walked out of the factory. They stopped the machines and held signs that read, "Fair pay for fair work." The owners called the police. The police broke up the protest with force. Many workers were arrested. The strike ended when the owners lowered the workday by a small amount. But the workers learned that together they could make the owners listen. This event shows how class struggle can turn into a collective action that forces change. A few years later, in 1871, the people of Paris rose up against the French government. The city's workers and lower-class citizens formed a council called the Commune. They took control of the city's schools, factories, and police. The Commune tried to run the city without a rich elite boss. They paid workers a living wage and gave them a say in decisions. The government sent troops to crush the Commune. The fighting lasted 2 months and ended with many deaths. The Commune is remembered as a bold experiment where the working class tried to replace the old order with a new one. It is a historic example of class struggle turning into a short-lived but powerful attempt to change society. Not everyone agrees that conflict is the only way forward. One counter-argument says that cooperation can replace conflict. It points to companies that share profits with employees. In such firms, workers receive a share of the company's earnings, and decisions are made together in committees. The argument holds that when owners and workers share both risk and reward, the need for struggle disappears. The idea is that fairness built into the rules can keep both sides satisfied. Another counter-argument claims that education and dialogue can end class conflict. It suggests that if workers learn about economics and owners learn about labor rights, they can find common ground. The argument says that mutual respect and open conversation can lead to agreements that benefit everyone. In this view, the battle is replaced by a partnership where both sides help each other grow. Even with these hopeful ideas, many modern situations still show class struggle. Gig platform drivers work for apps that set the price of each ride. The platform takes a large cut of each fare. Drivers often complain that they cannot earn enough to cover gas and car maintenance. The platform says it must keep a fee to maintain the technology and safety features. Drivers sometimes organize protests, ask for better pay, or form associations. The pattern of owners setting terms and workers pushing back repeats. In the world of retail, large chain stores buy goods from factories overseas. The factories pay low wages to workers in distant countries. The stores sell the products at high prices in wealthy neighborhoods. Workers in the factories may form unions to demand higher wages and safer conditions. The stores may promise to buy only from factories that meet certain standards. This back and forth shows a modern version of class struggle that stretches across continents. Modern scholars still talk about Marx ideas. Some call themselves neo-Marxists. They apply the concept of class struggle to digital media, saying that the owners of data and platforms hold power over the users who generate content. Others look at environmental issues, arguing that the drive for profit pushes owners to exploit natural resources, while ordinary people suffer the consequences. These interpretations keep the core idea alive, that the clash between those who control resources and those who must work for them shapes the world. An analogy can help picture class struggle. Imagine a playground seesaw. One side holds a heavy stone, the other side a child. The stone represents the owners, the child the workers. If the stone stays heavy, the child cannot rise. If the child gathers friends and sits together, their combined weight can balance the stone. The seesaw moves only when the two sides push against each other. The push and pull create motion. In class struggle, the push comes from workers demanding better terms, and the pull comes from owners defending profit. The movement of history, like the seesaw, depends on that tension. A quote from Marx's own words clarifies the point. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx wrote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." This line says that every age has seen groups with different power levels fighting over resources. Another quote from Marx says economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 adds, "Though the worker becomes a commodity, a thing to be bought and sold." This sentence shows how the worker can be treated like an object when the struggle is ignored. When the Paris Commune tried to run a city without a rich boss, the writer Victor Hugo praised it. He said, "The Commune is a spark that may one day light a great fire." Hugo's words capture the hope that a brief struggle can inspire larger change. The 1842 Preston strike also left a mark. A local newspaper reported, "The weavers have shown that united hands can bend even the hardest iron." The report shows how a small group can make a big impact. In everyday life, the coffee shop scene can turn into a small negotiation. The barista may ask for a tip share system where each drink's tip is split equally among all staff. The owner may agree, seeing that happy workers keep customers coming back. If the agreement works, the tension eases. If not, the barista may look for another job, and the owner may lose a good employee. This small story mirrors larger patterns of conflict and compromise. A student may join a student union that meets with university leaders. They might propose a tuition freeze for the next 2 years. The university may agree to a partial freeze, citing budget constraints. The student feels heard, and the university avoids a protest. The outcome shows how dialogue can soften the clash, yet the underlying issue of who pays for education remains. The gig driver protests in many cities have led some platforms to create driver councils. These councils give drivers a voice in setting fares and policies. The platforms claim the councils improve fairness. Critics say the councils have little real power because the platform still controls the algorithm. The situation illustrates how cooperation can be offered, but the balance of power may still favor owners. In the retail supply chain, a clothing brand announced a fair wage program. The brand promised to pay a living wage to workers in its factories. The factories, however, faced higher costs and sometimes cut jobs to stay afloat. The brand's promise created a new tension. Workers wanted the wage. Owners wanted to keep prices low. The struggle continued, showing that promises of cooperation can still hide conflict. Modern political movements also use the idea of class struggle. Some activists organize living wage campaigns in cities. They march, hold rallies, and meet with city councils. The councils may pass a minimum wage increase. The increase helps many workers, but some small businesses claim the higher wages hurt their profit. The debate continues, showing that even when a compromise is reached, the underlying tension does not disappear. In academic circles, a professor of sociology might explain that class struggle is not only about money. It also includes cultural power. The owner decides what music plays in the coffee shop, what uniforms workers wear, and how customers are greeted. The workers may resist by playing their own music or changing the way they interact with customers. This cultural push adds another layer to the struggle. A final example comes from the world of technology. Open-source software developers contribute code for free. Companies use that code to build profitable products. The developers may ask for recognition or a share of revenue. Some companies set up dual licensing models that let developers earn money while still keeping the software open. The negotiation between free contributors and profit-seeking firms shows a modern twist on the classic clash. All these stories, past and present, point to one clear idea. When one group controls the means to produce something, and another group must sell their labor to use those means, a tension is created. That tension can turn into a fight, a negotiation, or a partnership. Marx believed that the fight itself drives change. Others think that partnership can replace the fight. The world shows both paths. The coffee shop, the student, the factory strike, the Paris Commune, the gig driver, the clothing factory, the open-source coder. All of them illustrate how class struggle appears in many forms. The calm narrator can end by reminding the listener that the concept of class struggle is not a distant theory. It is a pattern that appears in daily life. By watching how owners set rules and how workers respond, one can see the engine that moves societies. Whether the engine runs on conflict or cooperation, the result shapes the lives of many. The words of Marx still echo. Workers of the world, unite. The quote invites people to see their shared interests. At the same time, the stories of cooperation suggest that people can also choose to work together. The choice between conflict and cooperation remains a central question for each generation. The lesson is simple. When people understand the balance of power, they can decide how to act. The story of class struggle continues, written day by day in coffee shops, classrooms, factories, and online platforms. Marx's critique of capitalism begins with a simple picture of a game. In that game, one player collects every point that is earned, while the other players keep playing but never see any score rise for themselves. Marx says that this is how profit works in a capitalist system. The owner of the factory, the shop, the bank, or the mine receives the profit. The workers who actually make the product get only a small piece of the total value they create. The profit, in Marx's words, is the surplus value that the capitalist extracts from the worker's labor. This surplus is not a gift. It is taken from the work that the laborer puts into the product. The worker receives a wage that is less than the value of what he or she has produced. The difference goes into the pocket of the owner. A second picture helps to see this idea. Imagine a garden that produces many fruits. The garden is tended by many hands, each person planting, watering, and picking. Yet only one person owns the garden. At harvest time, that owner walks through the rows, gathers all the fruit, and sells it. The helpers receive a small payment for the day's work, but they do not own any of the fruit. Marx compares this to the way ownership works under capitalism. The means of production, the land, the machines, the factories, are owned by a few. The workers own only their own labor power, which they must sell to survive. The fruits of their labor become the property of the owner. Marx writes, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." He sees the relationship between owners and workers as a class struggle. The owners, whom he calls the bourgeoisie, own the capital. The workers, the proletariat, own only their capacity to work. The profit that the bourgeoisie takes is called surplus value. Marx argues that surplus value is hidden in the price of the product. The price looks like the cost of raw material plus wages, but it also contains the unpaid labor of the worker. This hidden part is what Marx calls exploitation. To understand how this idea grew, it helps to look at the rise of the railroads in the 19th century. When the United States built its first transcontinental railroad, investors poured huge sums of money into the project. The investors formed large corporations, bought the land, and hired thousands of laborers to lay the tracks. The workers were paid daily wages that barely covered food and shelter. When the railroad opened, the owners earned massive profits from ticket sales and freight charges. The workers, who had built the tracks, saw only a modest increase in their wages. Marx used the railroad boom as an example of how new technology can increase the wealth of owners while the laborers remain poor. A similar story unfolded in the early stock exchanges of Europe. In the 17th century Dutch Republic, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange allowed merchants to buy and sell shares of trading companies. The Dutch East India Company issued shares that could be bought by anyone with enough money. Investors bought shares, hoping the company's voyages would bring back spices and gold. The profits from those voyages were paid out as dividends to the shareholders. The sailors and dock workers who loaded the ships, who built the ships, and who tended the warehouses received only wages. When a voyage turned out well, the shareholders celebrated, while the laborers saw little change in their daily lives. Marx pointed to these early markets as the beginning of a system where ownership of capital could generate profit without direct labor. Marx does not stop at describing the problem. He also explains why the system keeps reproducing itself. He says that the profit motive pushes owners to seek cheaper labor. This leads to longer working hours, lower wages, and sometimes dangerous conditions. The competition among owners forces each to cut costs, which often means paying workers less. This competition also drives owners to invest in new machines. The machines can produce more with fewer workers, which makes the workers' bargaining power even weaker. Marx calls this process the concentration of capital. Over time, a few large firms dominate the market, and the majority of people remain small workers. In modern terms, this can be seen in large tech companies that own the platforms where many people work. The platform owners collect fees from each transaction, while the gig workers who deliver food or drive rides get a small cut. The platform's profit grows even as the workers' earnings stay low. Marx would say that the platform owners are extracting surplus value from the labor of the gig workers, just as the railroad owners did in the 1800s. Marx also offers a way to see profit as a kind of vampire that lives on labor. He writes, "Kapital is dead labor that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labor." In this image, capital is not a neutral tool. It is a force that feeds on the work of people. The more capital grows, the more it can take from workers. The workers become a mere appendage of the machine, losing control over their own work. There are strong counter-arguments to Marx's view. One common claim is that capitalism has raised living standards for many people. Proponents point to the increase in average life expectancy, the spread of education, and the availability of consumer goods. They argue that without the profit motive, there would be no incentive to create new products, improve technology, or lower prices. In the United States, the average household income rose dramatically from the early 20th century to the present. Many families now own cars, appliances, and smartphones, items that would have been unimaginable in the era of early industrial capitalism. Supporters of capitalism say that these improvements are evidence that the system works. A second counterargument says that capitalism reduces poverty worldwide. The World Bank reports that extreme poverty has fallen from about 40% of the global population in the 1980s to less than 10% today. Advocates argue that market economies have lifted millions out of hunger and disease. They claim that open markets allow entrepreneurs to start businesses, create jobs, and generate wealth. The spread of global trade, they say, brings cheap food and clothing to people who once could not afford them. In this view, the profit that owners earn is a sign that the system is producing more than enough to meet the needs of many. Marx does not deny that some people have become wealthier. He acknowledges that capitalism can produce a higher total amount of goods. However, he stresses that the distribution of those goods is deeply unequal. The wealth created by the system ends up concentrated in the hands of a few owners. The majority of workers receive only a fraction of the total value. Marx argues that the rise in average living standards hides a growing gap between the rich and the poor. He writes, "The increase in the productive forces is not accompanied by an equal increase in the freedom of the working class." In other words, more goods do not automatically mean more freedom for the workers. Real-world examples show both sides of the argument. In South Korea, rapid industrial growth in the late 20th century turned the country from a poor agrarian society into a high-tech economy. The government encouraged private firms, and large corporations like Samsung and Hyundai grew huge. Workers in these factories earned wages that rose over time, and many families moved into modern apartments. Yet the gap between the top executives and the average factory worker remained wide. Labor unions often fought for better pay and safer conditions, showing that the profit motive could coexist with worker activism. Another example comes from the gig economy in many Western cities. Ride-sharing apps promise flexible work and extra income. Some drivers report earning enough to pay bills, while others struggle to cover gas and car maintenance. The companies behind the apps report billions in profit each year. The drivers' earnings are a small slice of that profit. This situation mirrors Marx's description of profit as surplus value taken from labor. The drivers' stories illustrate how the same system can produce both opportunity and exploitation. Modern interpretations of Marx's critique often focus on the concept of alienation. Marx says that workers become alienated when they cannot see the connection between their labor and the final product. In a factory, a worker may only turn a screw and never see the finished car. The work feels meaningless, and the worker feels detached from the result. Today, many office workers type data into spreadsheets without ever meeting the customers who use the software. The feeling of alienation can lead to stress, burnout, and a sense that work is just a means to survive. Some scholars argue that technology can reduce alienation by giving workers more control. Open-source software projects, for example, allow programmers to see the whole product and contribute directly to its design. In these communities, the line between owner and worker blurs, and the surplus value is shared more evenly. This modern twist shows how Marx's ideas can be applied to new forms of work. Marx also warned about the reserve army of labor. He meant that capitalism keeps a pool of unemployed people who can be called upon when needed. This reserve forces workers to accept lower wages because they fear being replaced. In the 1930s, the Great Depression created a massive reserve army as millions lost their jobs. Employers could hire new workers at lower wages, and those who kept their jobs had little bargaining power. The reserve army kept wages down and profit up. This pattern repeats in later recessions, showing that Marx's observation still holds relevance. Historical anecdotes add color to the story. When the first railroad line was completed across the United States in 1869, the owners celebrated with a golden spike ceremony at Promontory Summit. The crowd cheered as the two rails met, symbolizing a new era of speed and profit. Yet the workers who laid the tracks endured harsh conditions, low pay, and frequent accidents. Many died from disease or injury, while the owners counted the revenue from moving goods and passengers. This event captured the stark contrast between profit and labor that Marx highlighted. Another anecdote comes from the early days of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company issued the first publicly traded shares. Investors gathered in a coffee house to buy and sell these shares. The company's voyages could bring back spices worth thousands of guilders. When a voyage succeeded, the shareholders received a large dividend. The sailors who risked their lives on the sea, however, earned only a modest wage. The profit from the spices enriched the shareholders, while the laborers at the ports saw little benefit. This early market shows how ownership of capital can generate profit without direct labor, exactly the pattern Marx critiqued. Marx's analysis of wages also includes the concept of necessary labor and surplus labor. Necessary labor is the amount of work a worker must do to earn enough to live, to buy food, clothing, and shelter. Surplus labor is any extra work the worker does beyond that, which creates profit for the owner. Marx says that the capitalist tries to reduce the time needed for necessary labor, so that more time can be turned into surplus labor. This is why factories push for higher productivity and longer workdays. The goal is to shrink the portion of the day that workers need to survive and expand the portion that produces profit. A simple way to see this is to imagine a day divided into two parts. In the first part, the worker makes enough to pay for a meal, a place to sleep, and basic clothing. In the second part, the worker continues to work, but the extra output belongs to the owner. The owner then sells that extra output and keeps the money. The worker's wage never changes, but the owner's profit grows. This pattern repeats every day in many factories, offices, and farms. Marx also discusses how profit can lead to cycles of boom and bust. When owners invest heavily in new machines, they can produce more goods than the market can absorb. Prices fall, profits shrink, and some firms go bankrupt. This creates a crisis, forcing workers to lose jobs and wages to drop. The cycle then repeats when new investment finds a fresh market. Marx calls this the tour of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. He believes this tendency makes capitalism unstable over the long run. In the 21st century, this cycle can be seen in the housing market. When banks lend heavily, many people buy houses, driving up prices. Builders construct new homes, hoping to sell them at high prices. Eventually, the market becomes saturated, prices fall, and many builders go out of business. Workers in construction. The idea of alienation sits at the heart of Marx's view of human nature. In a calm voice, the story begins with a simple picture that many people know well. Imagine a person scrolling through a phone, thumb moving from post to post, feeling a thin thread of connection to the world. The feed shows pictures of friends, news, memes, but the feeling of real contact stays out of reach. The person may smile at a joke, yet a quiet sense of emptiness lingers. Marx would call this a form of alienation, a separation between the self and the activity that should give life meaning. Now picture a worker on an assembly line. The same hand reaches for a bolt, then a screw, then another bolt, again and again. The rhythm is steady, the task is clear, but the worker does not see the finished product. The work becomes a series of motions that do not belong to the worker's own goals. In Marx's words, the worker becomes mere appendage of the machine. This feeling of being apart from one's own labor is what Marx called alienation. Marx's theory of alienation grew out of the changes that swept Europe in the early 19th century. The Industrial Revolution turned many people from farmers and artisans into wage earners in large factories. One historical anecdote comes from the town of Manchester in the 1830s. A young woman named Mary worked in a cotton mill that ran day and night. She was paid a few shillings for each basket of cloth she filled. The mill owner set the pace with a loud whistle, and the workers had to keep up or lose their jobs. Mary wrote a letter to a local newspaper describing how the constant clatter of the machines drowned out any thought of her own dreams. She said, "I feel as though I am part of the loom, not the one who owns it." This letter was later quoted by early socialists as a vivid illustration of how the worker loses a sense of self in the factory. A second anecdote comes from a small socialist club that met in a cellar in Paris in 1845. The club members were artisans, bakers, and small shop owners who had seen their trades squeezed by larger factories. They gathered to discuss a pamphlet written by Karl Marx titled Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. In the meeting, a baker named Jacques stood up and said, "When I knead the dough, I feel the dough is part of me. But when I sell the bread to a merchant who then sells it for profit, I feel the bread is no longer mine." Jacques' words echoed Marx's claim that alienation is not just about work, but about the loss of ownership over the products of one's own labor. Marx identified four main ways that alienation shows up in a capitalist system. First, the worker is alienated from the product of labor. The thing that is made belongs to the owner, not the maker. Second, the worker is alienated from the act of production itself. The work becomes a forced activity, not a free expression. Third, the worker is alienated from other people. Competition and the need to sell one's labor turn relationships into market exchanges. Fourth, the worker is alienated from the species essence, the part of humanity that seeks to create and shape the world. In a calm tone, the narrator explains that Marx believed these four forms are linked, each feeding the others. To bring these ideas into today's world, the script offers an everyday example that many can picture. A person works as a customer service representative for a large online retailer. The job requires answering the same questions about shipping, returns, and refunds hour after hour. The script describes how the employee follows a script, clicks the same buttons, and never sees the actual product moving through the warehouse. The employee may feel that the work is meaningless, that the voice on the other end of the call is just a number, and that the job does not reflect the person's true abilities. This modern scene mirrors the same pattern that Marx described in the factories of the 19th century. Another modern illustration comes from the gig economy. A driver for a ride-sharing app spends the day picking up strangers, following a GPS route, and waiting for the next request. The driver earns a fee for each ride, but the platform controls the price, the rating system, and the time between rides. The driver may feel like a tool that the app uses, rather than a person who chooses each journey. The script notes that this feeling of being reduced to a data point is a fresh version of alienation. The script then moves to the question of whether alienation is truly a product of the system or simply a personal feeling that can arise anywhere. Two counterarguments are presented in a balanced way. The first counterargument comes from a psychologist who argues that alienation is a matter of individual mindset. The psychologist points out that some people thrive in repetitive jobs, finding comfort in routine and clear expectations. For these workers, the sense of purpose comes from the stability of a paycheck, not from creative expression. The psychologist says, people can feel fulfilled by doing the same task day after day if they view it as a means to an end, such as providing for a family. This view suggests that alienation is not inevitable, but depends on how a person interprets their work. The second counterargument is offered by a cultural critic who claims that alienation can happen in societies without capitalism. The critic points to small, agrarian communities where people still feel isolated from their work because of personal conflicts, health issues, or lack of community support. The critic cites a study of a remote village in the Andes where farmers reported feeling disconnected from the land due to drought and the loss of traditional rituals. The critic argues that alienation can arise from personal loss, grief, or psychological factors, not only from economic structures. This perspective pushes back against the idea that alienation is always a symptom of capitalism. After presenting the counterarguments, the script returns to Marx's response. Marx would say that personal feelings of emptiness are often shaped by the larger social and economic forces around them. He would point to the fact that in societies where workers own the means of production, the feeling of alienation drops dramatically. In a calm tone, the narrator explains that Marx believed that when people control the tools they use, the products they make, and the decisions about how to work, the sense of separation fades. The script now explores how alienation connects to human nature. Marx believed that humans are naturally creative, social, and capable of shaping the world. When the social order blocks these capacities, people feel a deep sense of loss. To illustrate this, the script uses an analogy of a garden. A gardener plants seeds, waters them, watches them grow, and finally harvests the fruit. The gardener feels a bond with the plants because the work is personal and visible. If the gardener were forced to tend a field owned by a distant landlord, using machines that do all the work, the gardener would lose the feeling of connection to the soil. This garden story helps the listener see how alienation cuts off the natural human urge to create. Historical anecdotes continue to give depth. In 1848, during the revolutions that swept across Europe, a group of workers in the city of Lyon formed a workers' club. They met in a small workshop after hours, sharing bread and stories. One member, a silk weaver named Pierre, described how the new mechanized looms took his place on the loom, leaving him to sort the finished cloth. He said, "I no longer feel the thread in my hands. It feels like a river flowing past me." The club used these stories to argue for a cooperative workshop where each worker would have a share in the loom and the profit. Though the club was eventually suppressed, its ideas lived on in later socialist movements. Another anecdote comes from the early 20th century, when a group of miners in the Ruhr region of Germany formed a solidarity union. The miners worked deep underground, using pickaxes to break coal. Their work was dangerous and repetitive. Yet when they organized to run the mine as a collective, they reported a sudden rise in morale. One miner wrote in his diary, "Now the light of the lamp feels like our own, not the owner's." This diary entry shows how changing the ownership of the means of production can reduce alienation. The script then turns to modern interpretations of Marx's alienation. Contemporary scholars often link alienation to digital life. They argue that social media feeds create a loop where users produce content, photos, comments, likes, while the platform extracts value from that content. The user feels both a creator and a product, leading to a split sense of self. The script cites a recent study that found people who spend more than 3 hours a day on scrolling report higher levels of loneliness and lower satisfaction with work. This data supports the idea that alienation can appear in the digital realm, not just in factories. A second modern interpretation connects alienation to environmental concerns. When people buy mass-produced goods without seeing how they are made, they feel distant from the natural world. The script tells the story of a young woman named Lena who buys a fast fashion dress online. She later learns that the dress was sewn in a factory that polluted a nearby river. Lena feels a pang of guilt and disconnection, realizing that her purchase contributed to harm she could not see. This feeling mirrors Marx's claim that alienated labor also alienates people from nature. Real-world applications of Marx's theory appear in workplace design. Some companies now adopt self-managed teams, where workers decide how to split tasks, set goals, and share profits. The script describes a small tech startup that lets engineers choose which projects to work on and how to divide the revenue. Employees report higher engagement and lower feelings of alienation. This example shows how changing the structure of work can address the problem Marx identified. Another application is found in community gardens in urban areas. Residents grow vegetables together, share the harvest, and make decisions as a group. Participants say they feel a strong link between their labor and the food on the table. This practice echoes Marx's hope that people can regain control over their work and overcome alienation. Throughout the segment, the script weaves in direct quotes from Marx's own writings. From the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, Marx wrote, "The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces, the more his product becomes an alien object that confronts him as something hostile." This line is spoken slowly, allowing the listener to feel its weight. Another quote from the same work says, "Man must become a free, conscious, creative being, not a cog in the machine." The script pauses after each quote, giving time for reflection. The narrator also includes a quote from a later Marxist thinker, Antonio Gramsci, who wrote, "The crisis of the present is the opening of a new horizon for the working class." This line links the old concept of alienation to the hope for future change. In a calm closing, the script ties together the everyday examples, the historical stories, the counter-arguments, and the modern applications. It reminds the listener that alienation is not a fixed state, but a condition that can shift when the way work is organized changes. By seeing the connections between a scrolling thumb, a factory loom, a ride-sharing driver, and a community garden, the listener can understand how the same pattern repeats across time and technology. The final thought is offered as a gentle invitation. The narrator asks the listener to notice moments in daily life where they feel separated from the work they do, from the people they meet, or from the products they create. By recognizing these moments, the listener can begin to ask how the larger system shapes them, and what small steps might bring back a sense of ownership and connection. In this way, the philosophy of Marx on alienation becomes a tool for personal insight and collective hope. Marx believed that a society could not move forward by tiny steps alone. He argued that the old ways of life would hold on tight until the people who suffered most would push for a big change. That big change for Marx was a revolution. He saw it as a sudden break, not a slow climb. In his own words, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." The idea is that the conflict between those who own the means of production and those who sell their labor creates a pressure that can only be released by a sharp turn. To picture this, imagine a school where the rules say that students must stay quiet in the hallway at all times. The rule was made by the administration to keep order, but it also makes the students feel trapped. One day, a group of students gathers, holds a peaceful protest, and demands a new rule that lets them talk in small groups during breaks. The school leaders listen, see the growing unrest, and finally change the rule. The change did not happen because the administration slowly thought about it. It happened because the students created a clear moment of pressure that forced a new decision. That moment is like the revolutionary spark Marx described. A second analogy can be drawn from a neighborhood that has a problem with street safety. For years, the residents have asked the city to add more street lights, but the request is always delayed. One evening, a series of break-ins shakes the community. The neighbors call a meeting, share their fears, and decide to organize a block watch. The city council, seeing the united front, quickly approves extra lighting and a patrol. The safety improvement arrives not from a slow, steady plan, but from a sudden, collective push that makes the authorities act fast. Marx would see this as the kind of decisive shift that can break the old pattern. These analogies help to see why Marx thought small reforms often failed to change the deep structure of society. He believed that the owners of capital would always find ways to keep the system working for them. Small changes might soften the edges, but they would not remove the core inequality. For Marx, a revolution is the moment when the working class, or proletariat, decides that the current system can no longer be tolerated and takes power to reshape the whole economic base. Historical evidence supports this view. In 1917, Russia experienced a massive upheaval that matched Marx's description of a revolution. The February Revolution forced the Tsar to step down, but the provisional government that followed kept many of the old economic relations. Workers and soldiers grew angry as food shortages continued and wages stayed low. In October, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized key points in Petrograd and declared a new government. Lenin wrote, "All power to the Soviets." The old order collapsed, and a new socialist state began to form. The Russian case shows how a sudden, organized push can overturn a long-standing regime. Another vivid episode occurred in 1848, when a wave of revolts swept across Europe. In France, after the February uprising, a provisional government tried to create a republic, but the king's forces soon retook power. In the German states, students, workers, and middle-class citizens gathered in town squares, demanding constitutional rights and national unity. In Vienna, the Austrian Empire faced street battles that forced the emperor to promise reforms, only to later crush the movement. Though many of the 1848 uprisings failed to create lasting change, they demonstrated the power of a mass movement to shake the foundations of old monarchies. Marx wrote about the year, noting that "Old people have risen, the old order is trembling, and the future is uncertain." The revolts gave a clear picture of how a large group, feeling pressed by injustice, can force a sudden shift. Marx did not think that any sudden change would automatically bring a perfect society. He warned that the new order must be guided by the working class to avoid simply replacing one set of rulers with another. He believed that after the revolutionary break, the workers would need to organize a dictatorship of the proletariat, a term that meant a temporary rule by the majority to dismantle the old structures. This phase would last only until a classless, stateless society, communism, could emerge. Even with this strong belief in revolution, there have always been voices that argue for reform instead of upheaval. One counterargument says that peaceful, step-by-step change works better because it avoids the blood and chaos that often follow a revolution. The British Parliament, for example, gradually extended voting rights through a series of reform acts in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Each act added more people to the electorate, reduced corruption, and improved working conditions without a violent overthrow. Critics of Marx point to this as proof that the system can adapt when enough pressure is applied, without needing to smash it. A second counterargument comes from modern social democrats who claim that strong welfare states can be built within a capitalist framework. Countries like Sweden and Denmark introduced universal health care, free education, and generous unemployment benefits through legislation passed by elected representatives. These reforms lowered inequality and gave workers many of the rights Marx wanted, all while keeping private ownership of most businesses. Proponents argue that the success of these nations shows that reform can achieve many of the goals of Marxist theory without the risks of a revolution. Marx's idea of revolution still finds echoes in today's world. In recent years, large-scale protests have risen in places where people feel that the system does not listen. In 2019, millions of people in Hong Kong took to the streets demanding more democratic freedoms. The protests created a moment that forced the government to reconsider some policies, even though the movement did not lead to a full overthrow. In the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement sparked a nationwide conversation about police reform and systemic racism. While most changes have been legislative or policy-based, the intensity of the protests shows how a collective outcry can create a pressure point that pushes institutions to act. Modern scholars interpret Marx's revolutionary idea in different ways. Some see it as a literal call for violent overthrow, while others read it as a metaphor for any deep transformation that changes the power structure. Cultural theorists, for instance, speak of cultural revolution to describe how media, art, and education can shift public consciousness. They argue that changing the way people think can be as powerful as changing who holds the factories. Yet even in these softer readings, the core idea remains. A large, organized shift is needed to break the old patterns. Real-world examples illustrate both sides of the debate. The Arab Spring began in 2010 when a Tunisian street vendor set himself on fire in protest of police corruption. His act sparked massive demonstrations across the Middle East and North Africa. In Egypt, protests led to the resignation of President Mubarak, showing a rapid change that aligned with Marx's view of a revolutionary moment. However, in other countries like Tunisia, the transition moved toward a democratic system through elections, suggesting that after a sudden break, reforms can still play a major role. Another example comes from labor movements in South America. In Brazil, the Workers' Party grew out of trade unions and social movements that first organized large protests for better wages and working conditions. Over time, the party won elections and implemented policies such as minimum wage increases and expanded social programs. While the initial pressure was revolutionary in spirit, the eventual outcome was achieved through democratic institutions, blending both the revolutionary push and reformist tactics. Marx himself offered a vivid picture of why a revolution might be inevitable. He wrote, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win." This line captures the feeling that when people are pressed by poverty, long work hours, and lack of voice, the only way out may be to break the whole system. He also warned that the ruling class would try to absorb some of the demands to keep power. In 1850, after the 1848 revolts, Marx noted, "The bourgeoisie has turned the revolution into a mere reform, and the people are left with a half-finished promise." This observation explains why many thinkers argue that reforms can be co-opted and lose their radical edge. The idea of a sudden shift does not mean that Marx ignored the importance of organization. He emphasized that the working class must develop class consciousness, a clear awareness of their shared interests and common enemy. Only when workers see themselves as a group can they plan a coordinated action. In the 1864 Workers' International meeting in London, Marx and other leaders called for the creation of parties that could lead the masses. He wrote, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." The call to unite is a reminder that a revolution is not a random riot. It is a planned, collective decision. Critics who favor reform argue that history shows many cases where revolutions led to new forms of oppression. After the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union turned into a one-party state where dissent was often punished. Some point to the Cultural Revolution in China, where a radical push led to chaos, persecution, and loss of life. These outcomes suggest that a sudden break does not guarantee a better world. Reformists claim that building institutions that protect rights and allow for peaceful change reduces the risk of such backsliding. Marx theory also includes the notion that the economic base of society shapes its political and cultural superstructure. In simple terms, the way people produce goods, whether by hand, machines, or computers, creates the rules and ideas that govern daily life. When the base changes, the superstructure must adjust. A revolution, then, is a way to replace the old economic base with a new one, leading to new laws, schools, and cultural habits. For example, after the 1917 revolution, Russia introduced collective farms, state factories, and free education. These changes reshaped how people thought about ownership and responsibility. In modern times, the digital economy offers a fresh angle on Marx's idea. The rise of gig work, platform companies, and algorithmic management has created new forms of exploitation. Workers often lack stable contracts, benefits, or a clear employer. Some activists argue that the only way to fix this is through a large-scale shift that redefines ownership of digital platforms, perhaps by turning them into cooperatives run by the workers themselves. This vision mirrors Marx's call for a fundamental change in the ownership of the means of production, updated for the 21st century. The concept of revolution also appears in environmental debates. Climate activists point out that the current economic system prioritizes profit over the planet, leading to dangerous warming. They claim that incremental policies like carbon taxes are not enough. Instead, they call for a green revolution, a rapid overhaul of energy production, transportation, and consumption patterns. The language echoes Marx's idea that a deep, systemic shift is needed when the existing system threatens survival. Marx's idea of a big shift is not limited to politics or economics. It can be seen in cultural moments too. The civil rights movement of the 1960s in the United States began with sit-ins, bus boycotts, and marches that forced the nation to confront segregation. The movement created new laws, such as the Civil Rights Act, but it also changed the national conversation about race. While many of the changes came through legislation, the initial pressure was a revolutionary surge that broke the old social order. In education, the push for universal public schooling in the 19th century can be viewed as a revolution in how societies view knowledge. Before the reforms, most schooling was private or religious, limiting access to the elite. When reformers organized mass petitions and public demonstrations, governments responded by establishing free schools for all children. This shift changed the relationship between the state and its citizens, giving more people the tools to think critically and participate in public life. Marx's view of revolution has been reinterpreted by later thinkers. Some, like Antonio Gramsci, added the idea of cultural hegemony, the way the ruling class spreads its ideas so that they seem natural. Gramsci argued that a revolution also needs a battle of ideas, not just economic change. Others, like the Frankfurt School, focused on how mass media shapes consciousness, suggesting that a revolution must also challenge the ways people are persuaded by advertising and entertainment. In contemporary political science, scholars study revolutionary waves, periods when many countries experience uprisings within a short time. The 1848 wave, the 1917 wave, and the 2010 Arab Spring are examples. Researchers note that these waves often follow a pattern: a crisis, a build-up of discontent, a triggering event, and then rapid spread. This pattern matches Marx's description of how class tensions build until they explode. The idea that change may need a big shift does not mean that all societies must follow the same path. Marx emphasized that each country has its own conditions, its level of industrial development, its class makeup, its political institutions. He wrote, "The story of Karl Marx's later works begins after the first volume of Kapital appeared in 1867. That publication was not a simple printing job. The manuscript had been hidden in a small attic in London, guarded by a loyal friend who feared that the authorities might seize it. When the book finally reached the press, the printer demanded a higher price because the pages were dense and the paper thick. The publisher, a modest firm called Verlag von Otto Meissner, agreed after a long negotiation. The first copies sold out quickly among scholars and activists, and the news spread through the coffee houses of Manchester and the salons of Paris. A young worker named Friedrich Engels, who had helped Marx with the research, wrote in a letter, "The book is a hammer, and the world will feel its blows." That moment marked the start of a new phase in Marx's thought, a phase that would shape politics, economics, and culture for more than a century. Volume I focused on the process of making goods, the way labor creates value, and the way capital takes a share of that value. After it was released, Marx turned his attention to the later volumes, which would examine the circulation of capital, the role of credit, and the tendency of profit rates to fall. These later works were written in a style that many readers found difficult. The sentences were long, the tables were full of numbers, and the arguments often moved through abstract concepts. Yet the ideas inside were meant to explain everyday life. Marx wrote, "The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. In other words, how things are made and sold shapes the whole society." One practical example of Marx's later ideas can be seen in modern budgeting apps. A person who uses a phone app to track income and expenses is, in a simple way, seeing the flow of money that Marx described as circulation. The app separates earnings, spending, savings, and debt, showing how each part affects the whole. When the app warns that a user is spending more than they earn, it mirrors Marx's warning that capitalists must constantly seek new markets to avoid losing profit. The app also shows how small, repeated expenses add up, much like Marx's description of how surplus value builds up in the hands of owners. By watching the numbers, a user learns to manage the same forces that Marx said drive the whole economy. Another everyday illustration appears in news stories about wealth gaps. A headline might read, "The richest 1% own more than half of the world's wealth." That fact is a direct echo of Marx's claim that the accumulation of capital is the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few. When a report details how a billionaire's fortune grew during a recession while many workers lost their jobs, it shows the class conflict that Marx wrote about. The story also shows how the system can produce extreme inequality, a point that Marx argued would eventually cause social tension. Marx's later writings also inspired early socialist parties. In 1869, a group of German workers gathered in a small hall in Leipzig to form the Social Democratic Workers' Party. They chose the name because they wanted to represent the working class in the political arena. The party's first program quoted Marx directly. "The emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself." The members believed that by organizing, they could turn Marx's analysis into action. They held rallies, printed pamphlets, and sent representatives to the parliament, hoping to change laws that favored capital owners. Their early victories, such as gaining the right to strike, showed that Marx's ideas could move beyond theory and affect real policy. A second anecdote comes from the Russian Revolution of 1917. When the Bolsheviks seized power, they carried copies of the later volumes of Kapital into the meeting rooms of the Soviet government. A young revolutionary named Lev Trotsky wrote in his diary, "The pages of Marx are heavy, but they are a map for the new world." The Bolsheviks used Marx's analysis of crisis to justify the nationalization of banks and factories. They claimed that by taking control of the means of production, they could end the exploitation described by Marx. Although the Soviet experiment later faced many problems, the initial enthusiasm showed how Marx's later work could inspire sweeping change. Modern scholars still read the later volumes for clues about today's economy. Some argue that the rise of digital platforms like ride-sharing services is a new form of surplus value extraction. When a driver works for a few hours and the platform takes a large commission, the driver receives only a small part of the fare. This mirrors Marx's idea that workers receive less than the value they create. Others point to the global financial crisis of 2008 as evidence of Marx's theory of overproduction, where too many goods are made, but not enough people can buy them, leading to a crash. These interpretations show that Marx's later works still speak to current events. Not everyone agrees that the later volumes are useful for everyday life. One criticism says that the dense language and heavy use of economics make the books hard to apply. A professor of economics once wrote, "The math and the jargon turn the ideas into a puzzle that most people cannot solve." This view holds that the complexity hides the practical lessons, making it difficult for activists to use the text in organizing. A second counterargument comes from a labor organizer who argued, "When the theory is so thick, it discourages people from joining the cause." The organizer claimed that people need clear, simple messages, not long chapters on the rate of profit. These critics suggest that Marx's later work, while intellectually powerful, may not be the best tool for grassroots movements. Supporters of Marx's later writings respond by pointing out that the depth of the analysis is needed to understand the hidden mechanisms of capitalism. They say that without a careful study of how credit works, for example, people cannot see why a small loan can lead to a large debt crisis. An analogy helps here. Imagine a river that seems calm on the surface. If the river's depth is not measured, a swimmer might be surprised by a sudden drop. Marx's later work measures the depth of the economic river, showing where the hidden currents flow. By understanding those currents, people can plan better bridges and dams. Another analogy compares the later volumes to a medical diagnosis. A doctor looks at many symptoms, runs tests, and then explains the disease. If the doctor only said, "You are sick," the patient would not know how to heal. Similarly, Marx's later books list many symptoms of capitalism: overproduction, falling profit rates, concentration of capital, and then explain the disease. This level of detail can help policymakers design more precise solutions, such as progressive taxation or regulation of financial markets. The influence of Marx's later work can be seen in contemporary movements that fight inequality. Activists who campaign for a living wage often cite Marx's idea that workers should receive the full value of their labor. In speeches, they repeat the line, "The worker must not be reduced to a commodity." A recent protest in a large city used a banner that read, "From capital to care, end the exploitation of labor." The banner quoted Marx directly, showing that the language of the later volumes still resonates. In the world of academia, a field called critical theory builds on Marx's later ideas. Thinkers such as Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer took Marx's analysis of capitalism and added a study of culture. They argued that media and entertainment also serve to keep people passive, much like the way wages keep workers from questioning the system. This blend of economics and culture shows how Marx's later work can be expanded to new areas. Even technology companies sometimes reflect Marx's insights. A popular budgeting app, for instance, uses algorithms to suggest ways to save money. The algorithm looks at spending patterns and predicts future cash flow, much like Marx's analysis of how capital circulates and seeks profit. When the app warns a user about budget fatigue, it echoes Marx's warning that constant pressure to produce and consume can wear down the worker. News reports about wealth gaps also bring Marx's later ideas to the public eye. A recent article in a major newspaper described how a handful of tech founders own more wealth than the combined income of millions of workers. The piece quoted an economist who said, "The concentration of capital is reaching levels Marx warned about." By linking current data to Marx's predictions, journalists help readers see the relevance of the older text. The legacy of Marx's later works is not limited to criticism of capitalism. Some thinkers have used his ideas to imagine alternatives. In the 1970s, a group of economists in Chile tried to create a people's economy that would limit the power of large banks. They called their plan social credit, a term that echoes Marx's study of credit systems. Although the experiment was short-lived, it showed that the later volumes could inspire real policy attempts. Another modern interpretation comes from environmental activists. They argue that capitalism's drive for endless growth, described by Marx as a tendency of the rate of profit to fall, leads to ecological damage. By pushing for endless profit, companies overuse natural resources, causing climate change. Activists cite Marx to argue that a different economic system, one that respects limits, is needed. This shows how the later works can be linked to concerns far beyond class struggle. Quotes from Marx's own writings help keep the ideas vivid. In Kapital, Volume 3, Marx wrote, "The circulation of capital is the movement of value, the movement of labor, the movement of the whole social life." In a later note, he added, "The law of value is the law that governs the whole of the economic life of the whole society." These lines remind listeners that the flow of money, work, and goods is at the heart of every society. Another powerful quote comes from the Grundrisse, a notebook where Marx drafted many of his ideas. He wrote, "All that is solid melts into air, all that is fixed falls apart." Though often quoted in other contexts, the line speaks to the constant change in the economy that Marx tried to capture. It helps explain why the later volumes focus on change, crisis, and transformation. The impact of Marx's later works can also be traced in education. Many universities include a course on political economy that uses the later volumes as a core text. Students learn how to read tables of data, how to trace the flow of capital, and how to see the connections between production and consumption. By teaching these skills, educators keep the ideas alive for new generations. Critics who claim the later volumes are too complex point out that most people never finish reading them. A survey of readers showed that less than 10% of those who started Kapital finished the whole set. The same survey found that many readers stopped after the first chapter because the language felt heavy. This data supports the argument that the books are not easy to use for quick action. Supporters respond that depth requires patience, just as learning a new language does. They argue that the payoff is worth the effort because the analysis can reveal hidden power structures. One activist wrote, "When the ideas click, the whole picture of society becomes clearer." This sentiment reflects the belief that the later works, while demanding, can change how people see the world. The legacy of Marx's later works also lives in popular culture. A recent television series set in a fictional factory used Marx's concept of alienation, the feeling that workers become strangers to the products they make, as a central theme. The show's creator said, "The idea that a person can feel disconnected from their own work is something Marx described, and it still feels true today." By Marx's ideas have been the target of many attacks. Some of those attacks are based on real problems. Some are based on misunderstandings. In this part of the story, the listener will hear why critics say Marx is wrong, how they sometimes read his work in the wrong way, and how a careful look can answer those worries. The tone stays calm and clear. The words stay simple. The ideas stay strong. One common criticism says that Marx wants to destroy all private property. Critics say that if the state takes everything, people lose the chance to own a house or a shop. They say that this leads to a world where the state tells everyone what to do. They point to the failures of some countries that tried to follow Marx. They claim that those failures prove the theory is bad. This criticism often mixes two ideas. The first idea is that any state that owns everything will be cruel. The second idea is that Marx himself said that the state must own everything forever. Both ideas are mixed together in many talks. A second criticism says that Marx's idea of class struggle is too simple. Critics say that people belong to many groups at once. They say that a person can be rich in one way and poor in another. They say that fighting only between two groups, the owners and the workers, ignores race, gender, and culture. They claim that Marx missed the real complexity of modern life. They also say that his predictions about a workers' revolution never happened. They point to the fact that many workers still vote for parties that do not want to overthrow capitalism. A third criticism says that Marx's economics are outdated. Critics say that his labor theory of value is wrong. They say that price is set by supply and demand, not by the amount of work put in. They claim that modern economics has moved past Marx's math. They argue that his ideas cannot explain why some products become cheap while others stay expensive. All these criticisms sound strong. They are often repeated in news shows, in school classes, and in online posts. They can shape the way people think about Marx, but many of those points are based on a misreading of the original text. They also ignore the ways Marx's ideas have been used in different times. To see how a misreading can happen, imagine a sports team that loses a game. The fans start to blame the coach for every mistake. They say the coach is the reason the team lost. They forget that the players missed passes, that the weather was bad, and that the other team played well. The coach may have made a bad decision, but he is not the only cause. In the same way, many people blame Marx for every problem that they think comes from capitalism. They point to any bad thing in the world and say it is because Marx's ideas are wrong. They forget that many other forces are at work. They forget that the people who tried to copy Marx also made many mistakes. Another everyday picture helps. Picture a family that has a lot of stress. The mother loses her job, the father works long hours, the children argue, and the bills pile up. The family starts to blame the teenage son for all the trouble. They say his bad grades are the reason the parents fight, that his mess in the house makes the mother sad, that his jokes make the father angry. The son is not the only cause of the stress. The job loss, the long hours, the bills, the arguments all play a part. When a group blames a single person for all the problems, they ignore the whole picture. In politics, some people blame Marx for every failure of a socialist experiment. They treat him like the teenage son in the story. They do not look at the Cold War pressure, the economic sanctions, the lack of democracy, the corruption inside the parties. The blame becomes a shortcut, not a full analysis. History gives two clear examples of how Marx's name was used in ways that do not match his own words. The first example comes from the early years of the Cold War. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became rivals. The Soviet Union called itself a workers' state. It said it was following Marx's ideas. In reality, the Soviet leaders built a powerful bureaucracy. They kept tight control over the economy and over people's lives. Many people in the West saw the Soviet system and said, "This is what happens when you follow Marx." They pointed to the lack of free speech, to the secret police, and to the forced collectivization of farms. They used those facts to argue that Marx's ideas always lead to oppression. A second story comes from the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The wall had divided a city for almost 3 decades. It stood as a symbol of the split between a capitalist West and a socialist East. When the wall fell, many people celebrated the end of a repressive regime. They said that the wall's collapse proved that Marx's ideas had failed. Yet, the events that led to the fall were more complex. They included a wave of popular protests in East Germany, the opening of borders in neighboring countries, the weakening of Soviet support, and the desire of people to travel and talk freely. The wall's fall was not just a verdict on Marx's theory. It was a mix of political, economic, and cultural forces. To say that the wall's fall proves Marx wrong is to miss the whole story. Marx himself wrote many things that can be quoted to clear up the confusion. In the Communist Manifesto, he wrote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." He meant that societies have always been shaped by conflicts between groups with different interests. He did not say that the struggle would always be between just two groups. In Kapital he wrote, "The value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required for its production." He was trying to explain how prices are linked to work, not to say that supply and demand do not matter. In a letter to a friend, Marx said, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." He wanted people to act, not to sit and only think. When critics say that Marx wanted to own everything for everything forever, they often forget that Marx saw the state as a temporary tool. He wrote that after a workers' revolution, the state would wither away. He imagined that once class differences disappeared, the need for a strong government would disappear too. He did not picture a permanent, all-controlling state. This point is missed when people read his work as a call for endless state control. Another point that is often twisted is the idea of alienation. Marx said that workers feel separated from the products they make, from the act of making, from other workers, and from their own humanity. He described a feeling, not a law. He did not say that all workers will always feel alienated. He said that under certain conditions, such as when a worker has no control over his work, alienation can happen. Modern psychologists have found that people who have more control over their jobs feel less alienated. This shows that Marx's insight still matters, even if the exact conditions have changed. Now the script moves to two counterarguments that defend Marx's relevance today. The first counterargument says that the problem of inequality is still huge. In many countries, a tiny group owns most of the wealth. The gap between the richest and the poorest keeps growing. The United Nations reports that the richest 1% own more than half of the world's wealth. This pattern matches what Marx warned about. He said that capitalism tends to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. The fact that this still happens today shows that his analysis still has a point. It also shows that the criticism that Marx's ideas are outdated does not hold when the data still fit his predictions. The second counterargument focuses on the idea of class consciousness. Marx argued that workers need to become aware of their shared interests. He believed that this awareness could lead to collective action. In recent years, many workers have organized across borders. They have used social media to share stories of low wages, unsafe conditions, and long hours. Movements such as the global climate strikes, the fight for a living wage, and the push for universal healthcare show that people are linking their struggles. This shows that the idea of a shared class interest still moves people to act. It also shows that Marx's call for solidarity still resonates. Another way to see Marx's relevance is to look at how technology changes work. Automation now replaces many manual jobs. Some people worry that robots will take away many jobs. Marx wrote about how machines can make workers redundant, leading to unemployment and social tension. His warning about the reserve army of labor, people who are ready to work but cannot find a job, fits the modern fear of a large group of people who are left out of the new economy. This shows that his ideas can help us think about how to handle the changes that technology brings. A final example of Marx's continuing influence appears in the field of environmental thought. Marx said that the drive for profit pushes people to use natural resources without caring for the planet. He called this a metabolic rift, a break between humans and the earth. Modern environmentalists talk about the same problem when they say that endless growth harms the climate. They use Marx's language to argue for a different kind of economy, one that does not put profit above the planet. This shows that his analysis still helps people understand big issues. To sum up, many criticisms of Marx are based on a narrow reading of his work. Some critics see only the parts that match their own view. They often blame Marx for the failures of states that called themselves socialist, even when those states changed Marx's ideas a great deal. They also ignore the parts of his writing that speak about temporary state power, about the need for workers to act together, and about the role of technology and the environment. The two everyday pictures of a sports team and a family help to see how easy it is to point the finger at one person or one idea. History shows that the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall were not simple verdicts on Marx. They were complex events with many causes. When the listener thinks about Marx, the voice invites a calm look at the facts. It invites a look at the original words, at the historical context, and at the way ideas travel through time. It invites a view that sees both the strengths and the limits of any theory. In that calm view, Marx's critique of capitalism still speaks to the problems of wealth gaps, of alienated work, of environmental damage, and of the need for people to join together. The voice ends with a quiet reminder that ideas are tools. They can be used well or badly. It is the care with which they are used that decides their impact. Marx's ideas still echo in the daily news that fills a phone screen. When a headline talks about a strike at a delivery service, the words feel familiar. When a friend asks whether to take a ride-share gig, the question can be linked to a theory that is more than a century old. In this part of the video, the calm voice will walk through a few everyday takeaways. The goal is to show how a simple look at class, value, and power can help a person read the world, decide about work, and share chores at home. First, the story of a gig economy driver is used. The driver signs up for an app that promises freedom. The app says the driver can work whenever a schedule fits. The driver can see a price for each ride. At first, the driver feels in control. Then the driver notices that the pay per mile drops when the city adds more drivers. The driver also sees that the app takes a cut of every fare. The driver wonders if the work is truly free. Marx called the work that creates value labor. He said that the value of a product comes from the time a worker spends on it. In a simple way, the driver's time is the real source of the ride's price. The app, however, does not pay the full value of that time. The driver keeps only a fraction. The rest goes to the company that owns the platform. This is what Marx called exploitation. It means that the worker does not receive the full benefit of the labor. The driver can see the pattern when the app changes the fee structure. The driver's earnings shrink even though the work stays the same. The driver can ask, am I being paid for my labor, or am I paying for the right to work? The answer helps the driver decide whether to stay, look for a different job, or organize with other drivers. Marx also warned that when many workers feel the same squeeze, they may act together. A real example happened in 2022 in several US cities. Ride-share drivers formed a coalition and held a coordinated stop work day. They turned off their apps for a few hours. The streets were quieter, and the companies felt the loss of service. The drivers used social media to share stories of low pay and high fees. The protest got coverage in the news. The companies responded by promising a small raise and a clearer pay breakdown. The event shows how a simple idea about collective power can turn into a real change. The story also shows that Marx thought about workers joining forces still has a place in the modern gig world. Now consider a different scene at home. Two partners share a small apartment. One partner works a full-time job in an office. The other works part-time from home. The chores are cooking, cleaning, and laundry. At first, the partner who works full-time does most of the cooking because the other partner is busy with meetings. Over weeks, the full-time partner feels tired. The part-time partner notices the imbalance and asks why the chores are not split more evenly. Marx talked about relations of production. In plain terms, that means how people divide work and how the results are shared. If one person does more of the unpaid work at home, that person is doing extra labor that is not paid. The extra labor still creates value. A clean space, a warm meal, fresh clothes. When the unpaid labor is not shared, the person who does it may feel less free and more burdened. The idea suggests that a fair split of chores can improve both partners' sense of freedom. A simple way to apply the idea is to write down who does what each week. Then the partners can trade tasks so that each person's total effort feels balanced. The conversation can become a chance to see how power can show up even in a small kitchen. A quote from Marx helps to frame this. In a letter to a friend, Marx wrote, "The emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself. In the home, the partners are both workers. They must shape the rules that free them from hidden burdens." By talking openly, they practice the same principle that Marx described for larger society. The next part of the script moves to recent protests that illustrate the power of collective action. In late 2023, a group of French teachers walked out of schools across the country. They protested a new law that would make it harder for them to strike. The teachers argued that the law would strip them of a key tool to improve pay and working conditions. The protest grew quickly. Students joined, and parents held signs. The government eventually agreed to postpone the law and open a dialogue. This episode shows how a clear demand, backed by a united group, can force a change. It also shows that the idea of class struggle, the push and pull between those who control resources and those who work, is still alive. A second anecdote comes from Brazil in 2022. A wave of protests erupted in São Paulo over rising housing costs. Workers from factories, service jobs, and informal sectors gathered in the city centre. They carried signs that read, "Housing is a right, not a profit." The protest pressured the city council to pass a law that capped rent increases to a modest percentage each year. The law was a direct response to the people's demand for a fair share of the city's resources. The episode reflects Marx's idea that when the many see a common need, they can shape policies that protect them. These stories help to ground abstract ideas in real life. They also show how the concept of fair sharing can be a tool for everyday decisions. When a person looks at a gig economy job, the question becomes, does the pay reflect the true value of the labor? When a couple looks at chores, the question becomes, does each person receive a fair share of the unpaid work? When a community looks at housing, the question becomes, does the system give a fair share of the benefits to those who need them most? Now the script presents two common counterarguments that say Marx's ideas are out of date. The first counterargument says that the world has moved past class conflict because many people own stocks, have savings, and can move between jobs easily. It claims that the old idea of a single working class versus a single capitalist class no longer fits. The argument points to the rise of the tech sector, where many employees hold equity and become wealthy. It says that Marx's model cannot explain this new mix of owners and workers. A response to this counterargument can be offered without breaking the third-person rule. The response notes that even in tech, most workers do not own enough equity to control the company. The majority still sell their labor for a wage. The owners of the equity are a small group that holds most of the profit. The pattern of a few holding power while many sell labor still fits Marx's basic picture. The response also notes that the rise of gig work creates a new class of people who have little security and few assets. The argument that class no longer matters overlooks the growing gap between those who own platforms and those who work on them. The second counterargument says that Marx's focus on material production ignores modern concerns like the environment, identity, and digital life. It claims that a theory built in the 1800s cannot address climate change or online privacy. The argument suggests that new theories are needed to handle these issues. A reply can be given by showing that Marx's core idea is about how people relate to the things they create and the power those things give to some over others. When a factory pollutes a river, the people who own the factory gain profit while the community bears the cost. This pattern is still about who controls resources and who suffers the consequences. When a social media platform collects data, the platform owners profit while users give away personal information. The same lens of who benefits and who bears the cost can be used to think about climate and privacy. Therefore, Marx's simple tool of looking at who gains and who loses can still be useful. To bring the ideas home, the script offers a final practical tip. When a person reads a news story about a new law that raises taxes on the rich, the person can ask, who will this help? Who will bear the cost? When a person decides whether to accept a part-time shift at a warehouse, the person can ask, does the pay cover the true value of the work? When a family decides how to split chores, the family can ask, does each member's effort feel balanced? By asking these three simple questions, a person can apply a Marx-inspired lens without needing a textbook. A final quote from Marx is used to close the segment. In a speech to a group of workers, Marx said, "History repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce." The narrator can explain that this line means that if the same patterns of unfairness keep showing up, they will appear in new forms. The gig economy, the housing market, and household chores are new forms of the same old pattern. By seeing the pattern, a person can act before the tragedy turns into a farce. The calm voice ends by reminding the audience that philosophy does not have to be distant. It can be a tool for everyday life. Marx's thoughts, when stripped of heavy language, become a simple guide to ask who is doing the work, who gets the reward, and how to share power fairly. Whether a person is delivering food, sharing a kitchen, or joining a protest, the same questions can help shape choices that feel just. The segment invites the listener to keep these questions in mind as the news scrolls, as the next gig offer arrives, and as the dishes pile up. By doing so, the listener can turn abstract ideas into small actions that add up to a fairer world.